I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for our CISLL Kickoff Event. Dr. Diego Román is coming to us from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which happens to be, just coincidentally, my alma mater, although we were not there at the same time. He is a professor of bilingual and bicultural education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and also a faculty affiliate in multiple programs at the University of Wisconsin. His research is sort of at the intersection of linguistics, science education, and environmental studies, and he was a 2020 National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow to multilingual students. And so in today's talk, Dr. Román will address the topic of complexity of internal linguistic discrimination in bilingual programs and how it impacts the identity of Latinx bilingual teachers.
Buenas tardes, everyone. I am really excited to be here with you all today. I am a professor of bilingual studies at UW-Madison. First, I would like to thank my collaborators with whom I did this work. Dr. Alberto Pastor, he's a professor of Hispanic linguistics at Southern Methodist University. Catherine Ward, she is a doctoral candidate in Hispanic linguistics at the University of Wisconsin. They both work in the context of language contact when, for example, Spanish is in contact with English in US context, or when Native American languages are in contact with either Spanish or English in different contexts of the Americas. So, for example, I am from Ecuador, and I study when Quechua, a language spoken in the Andes of Ecuador, it's in contact with Spanish, and how Spanish changes and incorporates words from Quechua, or how Quechua changes when incorporating words from Spanish because of the centuries of contact between both languages. In the US context, the most familiar context in this area is Spanish-English. In other areas is Chinese. I worked and lived in California. And then you will find, again, inside those varieties, Cantonese or Mandarin. And if you are studying Spanish, if you go, we were just talking in lunch that you might want to go to Miami, right? In there you will have the Caribbean varieties of Spanish, which is a completely different dialect, a completely different variety that also impacts the Spanishes that we use. So this is my background. So I did my doctorate at Stanford University in the field of, it's called educational linguistics, applied linguistics, working with teachers who work with multilingual learners. I also did a master's in linguistics and a master's in biology, because in my research I tried to understand how teachers talk or frame environmental issues with multilingual learners. So I tried to see, for example, when teachers in rural Wisconsin, I work with districts in rural Wisconsin that are experiencing this demographic change. For example, I work with a district between Eau Claire and La Crosse in the border with Minnesota that is right now 70% Latino, Hispanic, Latinx. And 10 years ago, it was the opposite, 70% white, 30% Latino. In the span of 10 years, it completely flipped. These are rural districts, so it's not Madison, it's not Green Bay, not Milwaukee. So it's happening all over the country in different regions of the state. But how do these teachers, who perhaps don't have any training in ESL, bilingual education, are presenting issues such as, let's say, climate change, or droughts, or flooding? And what I have discovered is that many times they just say, all of us are suffering from it, without considering that low-income populations, that many times happen to be communities of color, suffer them in higher degrees or higher rates because they don't have the money to, let's say, move to a different place. So how do they do that in their discourses? How do we frame that? And how can we better reflect these discussions in a linguistically and culturally relevant way? So I lived in Wisconsin for 5 years. 20 years ago, I was a teacher near Whitewater, and I did my master's at Whitewater. Originally from Ecuador, but I lived in Honduras. We had a Honduran student during lunch, and she was so happy to know that I was in Honduras. In my research, I used the term Latinx. In Wisconsin, the student organization, they call themselves the Latine student organization with an E at the end, because we don't have words that end in X in Spanish. So there is this resistance to say Latinx because it doesn't sound natural. Versus in Spanish, we have an LE pronoun, les doy, that is gender neutral. So E is becoming more and more accepted to signify this gender inclusivity. There is a poet, his name is Rubén Medina. If you are familiar with literature in Spanish, he is part of the Movimiento Infrarrealista. There is a book called Los Detectives Salvajes, The Savage Detectives, that is considered one of the most famous, latest, or contemporary novels from Latin America. So he's part of that movement with Roberto Bolaño, the author of Los Detectives Salvajes, and he presented this book recently at UW-Madison about who are Latinx at this moment in time in the US.
This crazy, noisy, and arrogant people who goes around saying disparates por aquí, por allá, que Los Angeles is a Latin American city, que Guatemala is already situated between Texas and Coahuila, que el Che Guevara and la Virgen of Guadalupe are two of the founding fathers of a new America, que su imagen can be seen por aquí, por allá, que la auténtica salsa se baila en Nueva York, que el mole tan auténtico como el de Oaxaca se encuentra en Echo Park en Brooklyn, que el sur del continente begins at the US-Canadian border, que el estado de California is moving at a fast pace to the East Coast, reversing the journey of the poor, ambitious, and disoriented European immigrants del siglo XIX, que los niños y niñas blancos are now speaking Spanglish and walking through the streets like they were dancing a mambo, que Zacatecas is just crossing the Chicago Skyway Bridge, que hay una larga lista de peticiones in public schools to learn Lakota, Zapotec, Quechua, Maya, Navajo, Mapuche, and Arabic. This crazy, noisy, and arrogant people who goes around saying disparates por aquí, por allá, invading our freeways, malls, universities, streets, concerts, invading our libraries, parks, invading our silences and our most profound secrets and unfulfilled dreams.
So I highly recommend this book. It has this bilingual edition. On the one side is in English, on the other side is in Spanish. And it kind of reflects what we're seeing right now. So he dedicated it to me, so I was so happy. For me, this is a personal journey. So this is my son. His name is Andres Román. He was born in California. Then we moved to Texas and then back to Wisconsin. We traveled to Ecuador after the pandemic during the summertime. And it was the first time that he went to see my family in 3 years. And I haven't been there in the same time, a little more. So, and when we went there, Andres said, I don't want to go because I don't speak good Spanish. He went to dual language schools in California, in Texas, but still he felt this need that he doesn't speak good Spanish. He didn't feel that his Spanish was good enough. And I was thinking, how can we change that? Where is he getting these messages that he's Spanish, even though he has been raised in a Spanish-speaking household? My partner, she speaks English with him, but I speak in Spanish with him. He still thinks that his Spanish is not good enough. And now, when I work with districts in cities and in rural areas, we don't have enough bilingual teachers. And what many districts are doing at super high costs are bringing teachers from Spain, from Mexico, from Puerto Rico, from Guatemala, who then stay for a couple of years because of visa issues, and then they have to go back to their countries, and the district has to do the process again. So the costs of bringing teachers from other countries is very high, but we are not kind of growing our own bilingual teachers. So districts are asking in many ways, what are we doing? What do we do? So this research started with this: why does my son think that his Spanish is not good enough, even though we speak in Spanish every day, we expose him to dual language programs as much as we can. So, and this is kind of the reality of Latinx community around the United States. It's the largest community, the second fastest growing after the Asian American communities. We published a paper, if you're interested in that research, kind of complexifying when we say Latino communities, what do we mean by that? This student, an NIU student from Honduras, she was saying, when people look at me, they assume that I am Mexican. And people are saying, can you prepare tamales? Can you bring me tacos? And she gets mad. Remember when during lunch she was saying that, right? And the same to me, like, so where in Mexico are you from? They said, no, I'm not from Mexico, I am from Ecuador. And I tried to understand the intention of the question. Like, are you trying just to make me feel like I don't belong here? Or are you really interested in knowing where I am from? Where is my heritage? Where is my origin? So, but anyhow, in Wisconsin, the average Latino was born in Wisconsin, is 25 years old, and may or may not speak Spanish. So it's not only California or Texas that are having a large percentage of Latino populations who were born here already, but Latino communities across the country are racialized, which means that when they look at you, they assume things about you without even knowing you because of the way you look, how you talk. There is a wonderful book called Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, in which people, based on your accent, assume things about your character, about your personality. Like your language becomes an icon in which people think that they can judge your personality or features about who you are. So these racialization processes happens in Latino communities in which they are made feel that they are just arrived, they have just arrived to the US, that they are not from here. When we were, there is a wonderful book called Spanish, an American Language by Rosina Lozano at Princeton, and she says Spanish was here before English. The first European language in the US was Spanish because of the Spaniard conquerors, but still, if we were to listen to the news, we will think that English was here far before, that Spanish is a language of the newly arrived immigrants with all of the connotation that that brings, right? So again, the Latino communities in the US are changing fastly. There are Latinos of different socioeconomic backgrounds. In fact, class is becoming a huge issue inside the Latino communities. Now you have professional Latinos, and you have Latinos who, or Latinx who may or are working in blue-collar jobs. So class is becoming a huge separation inside the Latinx communities and with all of the repercussions of what that brings. However, there is a professor in Berkeley who says, we all share histories of systemic neglect and exclusion, as well as some colonial and linguistic past. So she's saying we shouldn't just, for example, when I go to my son's school, just do a celebration of bring your own food from, and let's eat tacos and enchiladas and bring something. Like when I was in Texas, I was asked to come dressed as an Ecuadorian. And I was like, what do you mean? Like I dress like this in Ecuador? but these celebrations of learning taken too far, like this diversity, versus addressing what are the systemic kind of inequities that put together populations from not only Latin America, but from different regions, in which these issues of systemic neglect that kind of unite these communities. What I am referring to, this shared linguistic past, is that Latinx communities across the US have a very love and hate relationship to Spanish. Some of them embrace it, depending on first generation, second generation. By the third, Spanish is almost lost. Like reflecting with any linguistic community of German happened the same thing, Czech. By the third generation, the language of the grandparents is almost lost. However, one of the Castro brothers, who was a candidate from the Democratic Party, he was asked to do his interview the same with Alessandra Ocasio-Cortez in New York. They were asked questions in Spanish, and they feel very self-conscious about using Spanish in public events. I had a chance to talk with one of the Castro brothers. He's a Stanford alumni at one event. And he said, what people don't remember is that my mom was physically punished for using Spanish at school. Why in the world my mom will teach me Spanish when she was physically punished for using it in Texas? So she said she thought that she was doing me a favor by not teaching me Spanish. But then you had this other candidate who was, I think, with Hillary Clinton. It was a white male who spoke Spanish, and they were asking him, but look at him. I said, but that's the thing. Like, if you are from the community, you have a different attachment to the language because it's connected to who you are, to who your family is, versus learning it as just to learn another language without connecting it to the people or connecting it to the social issues that that community is living through. There is a contentious relationship between Spanish, English, and the Latinx communities depending on generation, class, education level, region of the country. In the border areas, for example, UT El Paso teaches courses in Spanglish. And you're expected to use Spanglish during the class. And that literature is written by American Latinx of different communities, in which you will address these issues through these authors. If you speak another language, we always use these hybrid language practices. That if you're with another multilingual who speaks the same languages, you will constantly go back and forth. You're not going to say the other multilingual, okay, we're going to speak in Spanish for 10 minutes, and then English for 10, and no Spanish allowed, okay? Go. So it will be the most unnatural thing to do, to stick to one language, if the other speaker is also multilingual. So I tell my students when I teach the bilingual courses at UW, that I tell them the discourse in schools is that monolinguals accommodate or do accommodations for the multilingual students, when in fact it's the opposite. A multilingual accommodates to the monolingual by sticking to one language, so the monolingual can understand what's going on. Do you see that? Like if I am among multilingual Spanish-English speakers, and a monolingual speaker will come to join the conversation, we will say, okay, let's stick in Spanish so that person doesn't feel excluded from the conversation. So we will stick to one language, but not to benefit us, it's to benefit them. If you think about the discourses, is that even in the lesson planning that we do with our teachers, we tell teachers, what are the accommodations that you are doing for your multilingual learners? Because what is centered is English as the norm. Any other thing is kind of the unusual or the not normal. So the discourses that we have been using so far is that there is one English, which is the standard English variety. Other varieties, let's say African American English, Chicano English, are seen as not the norm, are seen as, yes, kind of a variety, but not centered, let's say, in discussions in classrooms, or let's read a book written by a Chicano author in which Spanish English is used and see why that person is using that with what purposes. And when we center only in English or only in one language, also in Spanish, because Spanish has the same thing, we have the standard Spanish with the standard variety. What that does to a teacher who is multilingual, it limits their linguistic richness. Like if a teacher is told you can only teach in Spanish for this period of time, if you were born here, let's say in the US, in some area of the US, then what happens with your multilingualism, right? If you have multilingual students who look like you, are like you, they also don't see themselves represented in the way discourse is done. And by no means I am saying let's get rid of language courses. What I'm saying is, do we have spaces in which multilingualism is celebrated? Like, are there any spaces in which we say, okay, it's okay for us to use all of our languages during this period of class? And to do that, we're going to read a book that uses more than one language. We're going to watch a movie in which multilingualism is used in the family, or in which a scientist is presenting a talk in a multilingual way. Or are there any spaces for that? In my experience, when those happens are like very occasionally. It's essentially only English, only Spanish, and very limited instances to celebrate bilingual language practices. There is this framework called Racial Linguistics by Nelson Flores and Rosa. Rosa did his work here in Chicago. It's wonderful. He's the author of this, Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race. It was an ethnography in a public school here in Chicago, in which he noticed that the Latino principal, I believe, was seen as not the expert. His leadership was always questioned. Like, he was very competent, but his leadership was questioned through the lens of he being Latino. And then he comes with this wide listening subject. We were thinking that we don't have an accent. People listen to us with an accent. Have you thought about it? Like, we don't talk with an accent. So if I was talking with another person who grew up and had my same life experiences, I will sound like them. And for each of us, we wouldn't have an accent. People who do not share our linguistic trajectories, they hear us with an accent. But accent is in the ears of the listener, not in the mouth of the speaker. And then, whatever is attributed to the features of that accent comes from this centering of how we perceive it, the perceptual apparatus. Like when we think, for example, of someone speaking with a French accent, we may think that they are very educated, that they have traveled. So we have these perceptions, these ideas. Versus if someone comes and speaks English with a Spanish accent, then other ideas come to mind. Maybe immigrant, who knows? Like many times when I walk in different campuses, people don't think that I am a professor. People ask me for everything but a professor, right? So these ideas about who represents what and where those ideas, ideologies come from. It is constantly questioning ourselves and our perceptions that through language bring these stereotypes and perception. So I really recommend those books about racial linguistics. So in my work, we try to address those education settings, asking teachers about how do they perceived, Latinx teachers, the Spanish of their students when these varieties were used in the classroom. And we did 2 phases of this work. We sent teachers a questionnaire, asking them if your student were to use, let's say, I went for a walk y la calle estaba sucia. Would you correct your student or not? And why? But it wasn't a language classroom. It was in the context of a science classroom. So for example, another one was, la flower estaba con mucho néctar, right? So that the teacher will understand what the student was saying. So there wasn't any need to correct the Spanish because it was about the idea, not the language, right? So with Wendy, we were saying, if you are in the language classroom in which the goal is to teach language, that's a different situation and different considerations should be made. But in classrooms, for example, now that dual language programs are becoming far more popular in Texas, California, Wisconsin, if you want to register your kid to a dual language program, you have to go through a lottery system because there is so much demand, especially from white families, for their kids to be bilingual. So you need to go through a lottery system, you need to, even when the kid was born, put them already in the waiting list, so they are in high demand. But again, which Spanish or which English are we thinking about? And then we asked some interviews to follow up on the reasoning if they corrected the student or not in those utterances, in those instances. So I come from this work, from Language Ideologies, which is kind of how broader social issues or context impact how we think about language, what we think about correct versus incorrect, how we think about educated versus not educated, how we think about mixing or not mixing. Like, where do we get that idea? Where do we get those ideas, for example, about the standard language, that there is one standard variety, which there is, but the other ones are not incorrect, right? Versus thinking that there is one because this one is better than the other ones, right? Again, with monoglossic language ideologies, that monolingualism is seen as the normal state of affairs, multilingualism is seen as unusual, versus the entire world is multilingual, that is the most common across the world, and monolingualism is the non-unusual. Finally, and this is one of the, if you take home some message, this is the take-home message, if you remember anything from this presentation, is that educators, we can embody both ideas at the same time. So I can think that I want my kids to learn good Spanish, and I can feel conflicted about it at the same time because I want to respect the way my kid talks. So it's okay to have that kind of tension inside yourself, that you want, on the one hand, to say, these students need this type of variety to succeed in the world, to pass these tests, to become engineers, to become professors. And at the same time, you say, but that is very normative. We are standardizing, we are centering, we are not acknowledging these histories of oppression of different cultures, languages across time. So, and these contradictory language ideologies that we can have. Now, in the world of languages, if you come from this world, standardized testing has been kind of pushing and pushing and pushing more and more the way we teach about, the way we think about good language teaching. Like in schools, we want our kids to pass the standardized test, and that is driving the way we teach, what we teach. In Texas, which is the quintessential standardized state, kids practice for the standardized test. My son had to take 3 practice standard tests to then take the real one. So they spent months just taking tests because they knew the schools received the funding according to well or not they do. So language teacher identities for a linguistically minoritized teacher, right? Let's say me teaching Spanish. We get into that conflict, right? On the one hand, you correct your students out of love. So if you have been discriminated against and you love someone, you want to protect them from that discrimination. So I myself sometimes tell my son, no, don't say it like that, or así no se dice. Or don't use that word, because if you say that word, people are going to think that you don't speak Spanish, or that you do not learn it very well. So it comes out of a place of love, because I love him, I want to protect him from these judgments that people make based on the way we talk, based on how we sound. On the other hand, again, these contradictory ideas. I know that what I am doing is not letting him live his multilingualism and live his own linguistic trajectory. So these ideas about how we have these multiple identities, that we are continuously negotiating who we are. Like we are always learning about who we are, how we deploy our way of being, and how sometimes they are in conflict. In this work, I use what is called a teacher solidarity lens. There is a beautiful article, if you like, how multilingual teachers, multicultural teachers work, that sometimes teachers are judged for everything, right? So teachers are asked to teach for the test, care for their students' well-being, social-emotional learning, care for their families, with very little compensation, right? So this work says we should also recognize the complex and high-demanding emotional and intellectual job that teachers do. So not just come and say you're not doing this and you're doing that and you're a racist and you're this too, and then judge them, versus saying we recognize that teaching is a very high-demanding, complex. When I was teaching middle school, I used to get home and go to sleep at 6, 7 p.m. I was done, like drained out, and then wake up, do lesson planning. And especially bilingual teachers of color, on top of all of these other things that every teacher do, they need to deal with caring for their students, but also protecting them, also respecting who they are, respecting the way they talk, respecting their immigration histories, because they went through that many times themselves. In terms of language, that kind of goes at odds with who they are, right? Those ideas about who is the native speaker. I'm working with one of my students from India, and she's constantly asked about how do you speak English so well? I said, because English is the official language of my country. So they are all constantly asked questions about that make them sound through this perception of who is the native speaker. And you don't match my idea of the native speaker, therefore you are not. So she's thinking about that in the context of Indian students in Wisconsin, about how they cannot be who they are, and they are always defending the right to be there. So this is the phase one. So we ask teachers again to react to questions, asking them about, would you correct if your student were to say this in your class? And this comes from Professor Kim Potowski. She is at UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, and she has done an inventory of the features of US Spanish. For example, case markers, este fin de semana voy a visitar mi abuela versus a mi abuela, right? Or in US Spanish, you would say, me encantan clases con señor Enríquez versus me encantan clases con el señor Enríquez, identifying it. And again, it's not wrong. It's just that this Spanish is developing or has been developed in the context with English. So in English, you see some of the English influences in the Spanish that is used in the US, right? Or gender agreement, cuando tengo vergüenza mi cara se pone rojo versus mi cara se pone roja, because in Spanish it's a gender language, and you match the noun with the adjective. We did prepositions, so we did many things, and we asked teachers to say, assuming that you get the idea, right? So that the idea came across. Would you correct the student or not? And teachers tended to correct the student. So teachers were, no, yes, I would correct it. And we said, again, but you understood, right? Yeah, yes, I understood, but I will correct the student. If the student is Latinx bilingual and the teacher is Latinx bilingual, would they correct them or not? If the idea came across, the concept was understood. So teachers tended to correct more than not. Why they would correct it? Because you don't say it that way. Así no se dice, right? Like using more like this, there is one way that is the correct way, these other ways are not the correct ways. There was one interesting thing in the linguistic part. If there was a code switch between sentences, that was seen as okay. You are doing it because you understand each, but if it was done inside the sentence, it was seen as you are switching because you do not know that word in either English or Spanish. So intersentential was seen as its choice, like a pragmatic deployment of resources. If it was inside the sentence, it was perceived as you are using it like a clutch, like you're using it because you do not know the word or the expression, and you have to resort to the other language because of that. In linguistics, that is called when speakers of the same community have these perceptions of right and wrong about the speakers of the same community. It's called internal linguistic discrimination. That, for example, that my Spanish variety, again, I am from Ecuador, I see it as better than a variety of Spanish that has this contact with English, or that includes these expressions drawn from English inside that Spanish. So that I will go and assume and correct a student, assuming that they do not know, and I will correct that. That comes from linguistics, and that is called the concept of internal linguistic discrimination. So we had 2 papers about this work. So in the first one, we presented it as these teachers were essentially not understanding the context, the linguistic trajectories of these students. They were not kind of seeing this from an asset-based perspective. The second phase of the study, we went and we interviewed these teachers, 16 of the 84 that originally filled out the questionnaire. These teachers were all Latinx, or all worked in 2 schools in Texas that mostly serve Latinx students, Hispanic students. These teachers had different lengths of residence in the US. Some of them were born here, others had moved at different stages of their life to the US. Also different sequences of bilingualism. Some of them developed simultaneously, some of them sequentially. So I am a sequential bilingual. I learned first the Spanish, then I learned English. My son is a simultaneous bilingual. He's learning it both at the same time. And they had different amount of teaching experience. So again, I can send you the paper. These are the characteristics of all the teachers we interviewed for this work. And what we discovered, which was very interesting, it wasn't as easy as we thought, that these teachers are basically discriminating against these varieties versus what I was referring before. They were doing it out of love. Like, it wasn't that they didn't appreciate the beauty or the dexterity. There is this professor, Román Martinez at Stanford, who says the dexterity of the multilingual, this wonderful thing that we do as multilinguals when we combine sentences. Like, I am amazed, like when I meet simultaneous speakers born here, how they fly through languages, versus to me, speaking English is like a cognitive puzzle, right? Like later in the day, my English goes down because my brain is tired. So when my brain gets tired, my English goes down because I have to think about it. It's not natural. Versus for a simultaneous bilingual, it's just both come. Like if you follow the work of Ofelia Garcia, so she says multilinguals have just one code in their brains. Both languages, 3 languages, 4 languages, just one thing, your linguistic repertoire. For a sequential bilingual, it might be that you might have 2 different, and then you need to deploy them, but it's more like a cognitive exercise, or perhaps how you do it, depending on the age of acquisition and all of these factors. Teachers had recognized the linguistic trajectory of their students. They also talked about that they were discriminated against as professionals or just in their daily lives because they had an accent, because they didn't pass a particular test, which was only in English, and all of those sort of things. They were focusing that they wanted their students to succeed. They equated that to mastering the standard variety of each of these languages, English and Spanish. What was happening is that it's backfiring with what was happening with my son. Because now my son doesn't want to speak Spanish because he thinks that his Spanish is not good enough. We focus on the correctness of a particular variety. The multilingual will not want to use it anymore. Will think, well, English is the one that I use. Everything in here works in English because of all of the English-centered, right? Why do I need to develop this Spanish? And anyhow, I try my best and I am judged. Have you seen the movie Selena with Jennifer Lopez? There is one clip in the movie Selena in which Selena wants to go to Mexico and sing in Spanish. And her dad says, don't even think about it. They are going to eat you up. And then she said, why? I am a great singer. I said, yes, but you have an accent when you sing in Spanish. And in Mexico, they want you to have no accent in Spanish. And then he says, Mexican Americans, we have it tough here. White Americans, we cannot have an accent in English. If we have an accent, then we're judged. For Mexicans, for Latinos, we cannot have an accent in Spanish. So we need to be best at both. We need to know about American culture, white culture, and Latino culture. We need to have all of these, but excel at both, because if you make a little mistake in each, then you are seen as you don't belong with us. You have all of these things to meet if you want to be accepted by each community. Teachers, in fact, they were telling us, I could switch when I am with my friends, but it's not okay in the classroom. This kind of this conflict. The teacher saying, I do it, but I do it because I know, but I want to protect them. Again, this tension that exists. For example, in Texas, the models, and it's kind of a common model across the US, you separate language in schools by day of the week or by subject area. So for example, in Texas, Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays are English days. Tuesday, Thursdays are Spanish days. Or it can be done by science is taught in English, math is taught in Spanish. But again, it's this language separation. Where are we creating these multilingual spaces in which we actually celebrate the multilingualism of our peoples? So that then they see it as valuable, so they see it as it can be used in formal settings. It's not just from home, it's not to only talk to grandma, to grandpa. I can use it, and I can use it with an academic purpose. And there is people, teachers that use it like me. I can see myself reflected in them. So that was how teachers were balancing this. Like, I use them, but I use it only in these settings. I think that they are wonderful multilinguals, but they have to separate them. The other interesting thing, I was telling Mandy, there is going to be a congress in Dallas about creating US-based norms of Spanish, because right now we think about the norms that guide the teaching of Spanish as the one that comes from monolingual countries. The Spanish that we teach here is the Spanish that is spoken somewhere else. I have a good friend from Colombia, and I would say, imagine that I go to Colombia, and a Colombian will say something in Colombian Spanish. I will say, no, that's wrong, because in Ecuador we say it this way. You say, and who cares that we are in Colombia? So, but in the US, if someone says we use Spanish this way, we say, no, because in Spain or in Ecuador we say it that way, even though the US has one of the highest numbers of Spanish speakers in the world, and it keeps growing. But the way all Spanish we think about it is matching the norms of somewhere else. Do you see that? Like right now there are institutes from Spain, from Mexico, who teach courses about the way to speak it. But I think that's great. It's not that I am opposed to it, but I think we should have the same here, like in which we say the way our bilingual speakers use Spanish in the US is these ways, and we should reflect that in programs that teach Spanish so they feel reflected in those, not in opposition to, but saying it's another variety, and we should address it and celebrate it. Do I have answers on how to do that? I don't. So don't think that I come to tell you, and do this, and then go and say the word. So one teacher was saying, on the one hand, what do? You accept that language, but that's also not asking kids to speak it in a very academic way. I can understand that that comes from your family, it's cultural, but in here we're going to speak it like this, because I want to protect you. And then another teacher said, I do not know, when we asked her, so what do we do? She said, I do not know. That's why I asked, to what extent do I correct them or not? Let them say it the way they say it. Sometimes I think when we are learning, do I correct it? I do not know. Like, how do we balance these two demands, right? In a context in which we know that is very standardized in terms of the way the speakers are judged. To finish the presentation, so these were kind of what we noticed. Again, teachers were doing it because they themselves had experienced linguistic discrimination. They were judged by their own community as well as by speakers of other communities. They wanted their kids to keep their Spanish. They say, I'm teaching you the correct Spanish because I want you to use it. I want you to keep your heritage. They wanted them to succeed academically and professionally, and they know that the tests use this standard variety as the norm, so they wanted to pass those tests. And one teacher said, because I went through this, so I tell my students, here I can protect you. I am the one in charge of this room. Outside of here, it will be somebody else. So you need to speak a good Spanish. If not, people are going to discriminate against you. Our first article was saying linguistic discrimination happens, teachers are doing it, even though they are Latinx bilinguals. It's because they are following the program guidelines that separate languages, so they are basically buying into these monoglossic standard language ideologies. However, when we conducted these more nuanced interviews, kind of a very different picture emerged into saying they are not just doing it because the school asked them to follow this curriculum. They were very open about their misgivings, these tensions that they experienced by doing so. They were also kind of reflecting these issues of systemic racism translated to language. People can segregate based on language versus with other dimensions. You cannot do segregation, but language is still, for example, you can group together the speakers or language learners in one group and for the entire day, and then they wouldn't have contact with, let's say, English speakers. So you can still do groupings based on language, and those are still accepted in some ways. However, teachers had a deep understanding, again, of their students' life experiences, and they were doing so perhaps with these unintended consequences of limiting the students' experiences or expressions of multilingualism. So we should talk among researchers of education, linguistics, psychology, on how to do this in a way that respects the student, that promotes bilingualism, that celebrates the multilingualism, the richness of the languages that are spoken in this country. Can we create endonormative standards, like standards that reflect Spanish varieties of the US, in which we say we teach the Spanish of Spain, of Mexico, or Cuba, countries from Latin America that are Spanish-speaking countries, but we also teach the varieties that are used here. Not as better or worse, just as one variety, another variety, just different varieties. We asked teachers, have you taken any courses in Spanish of the US or heritage language speakers? And many of them said, no, I took Spanish courses, but I never took a course of language contact or language development in a multilingual society, which is very different than developing Spanish in Mexico or developing Spanish in the US, in Ecuador. And we should think about what will it mean to teach multiple varieties of Spanish? Like what resources should we devote to do that? So I was super excited to hear about the grants. This is something that is happening in schools right now, rural areas of these different states in the Midwest. They want to understand how do we do it in spaces that were traditionally non-diverse, but now have all of these multilinguals, and we want to be culturally respectful, linguistically relevant. How do we do it? So if any of you want to explore those with those grants offered, which is fantastic, I wish we had those, it would be fantastic. I really and truly encourage you to do that. So, and this is my email. I will be happy to send you any papers or anything that I mentioned during the presentation. Thank you very much.